On a hot morning in late July of 1920, a crowd packed the narrow sidewalk on School Street in Boston, spilling off the curb and into the road, and almost every man and woman in it was clutching a small printed slip of paper. The slips were promissory notes. Each one was a promise to pay double the money in 90 days, signed by a smiling little Italian immigrant who, only 18 months earlier, had landed back in the city with empty pockets and a head full of schemes. Now, he was the most famous man in Massachusetts. Police had to be called to keep order. Reporters elbowed through the press. And the man at the center of it, a slight figure barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, in a crisp summer suit, came out to the crowd, carrying trays of coffee and sandwiches, telling them all to be patient, that there was money for everyone, that no one who trusted him would ever lose a cent. Within 3 weeks, he would be in jail. Within a month, the savings of some 40,000 people would be gone, and the name on those little slips of paper would outlive every one of them, because it would become the word we still use, a century later, for the oldest swindle in the world. His name was Charles Ponzi. You have heard it. Almost everyone has. We call it a Ponzi scheme. We use his name the way we use the word for a sandwich or a cardigan, without a thought for the person it came from. But here is the strange part. The thing that made Charles Ponzi famous, the engine he claimed was generating those impossible returns, was a humble little coupon for postage stamps that almost nobody in his crowd understood, and that, on the scale he was promising, could not possibly have worked. He did not get rich selling stamps. He got rich because, for about 8 months in 1920, thousands of ordinary Bostonians, school teachers and policemen and grocers and widows, decided that the laws of money no longer applied to a man who smiled at them and told them what they wanted to hear. This is the story of how he did it, where the trick came from, and how a single newspaper, doing the slow and unglamorous work of arithmetic, brought the whole thing down in a matter of days. To understand how a nation got fooled, you have to start with the man, because the man had spent his whole adult life rehearsing for this. Charles Ponzi was born in 1882 in the town of Lugo in the north of Italy. He came from a family that had once had a little money and a little standing, and lost most of it, which is a particular kind of upbringing. It teaches a boy that respectability is a costume you can put on, and that the people who have money are not necessarily smarter than you, only luckier. He drifted through school, ran up debts, and in 1903, at the age of 21, his family put him on a ship to America in the hope that the new country might make something of him. He arrived in Boston on the 15th of November, aboard the steamship Vancouver. By his own cheerful admission, he had gambled away most of his savings during the crossing and walked down the gangplank with $2.50 in his pocket. Years later, he liked to say it like a punchline. He had landed, he said, with $2.50 in cash and $1 million in hopes. For the next several years, those hopes did not pay off. He washed dishes in restaurants and slept on the floor. He waited tables and got himself fired for short-changing the customers and skimming from the till, which tells you something about where his mind already was. He moved from city to city, never settling, never quite making it. And in 1907 he went north, across the border to Montreal, and took a job that would shape everything that came after. He became a teller at a small bank called Banco Zarossi. The bank had been set up by a man named Luigi Zarossi to serve the flood of Italian immigrants pouring into the city. It was paying its depositors 6% interest, which was double the going rate, and to a young clerk like Ponzi, that was a puzzle worth solving. Where was the money coming from? He figured it out fast. The bank was not earning that 6%. It had made bad loans on real estate, and it was bleeding money. Zarossi was paying the interest on the old accounts with the cash coming in from new accounts. As long as new depositors kept walking through the door, the scheme held. The day they stopped, it would fall apart. And one day it did. The bank collapsed. Zarossi grabbed a pile of the depositor's money and fled to Mexico, leaving Ponzi behind in a city where he now had no job and no prospects. Remember that lesson, because Ponzi never forgot it. He had watched, up close, a man pay yesterday's promises with today's deposits, and he had seen exactly how long you could keep it spinning. That was not a theory he read in a book. It was an apprenticeship. What he did next was clumsier. Broke and desperate, he walked into the empty office of one of the bank's old customers, found a checkbook lying around, and wrote himself a check for $423.58, forging the signature of one of the company's directors. He was caught almost immediately. He spent 3 years in a Canadian penitentiary as inmate number 6660. When he got out, he tried to slip back into the United States and got caught again, this time smuggling a group of Italian immigrants across the border. That earned him 2 more years in the federal prison in Atlanta. By the time he was finally free and back in Boston, Charles Ponzi was in his mid-30s, an ex-convict twice over, with no money, no trade, and no reputation worth anything. He married a young woman named Rose Ginecco, took a string of small jobs, and by all appearances was just another struggling immigrant in a city full of them. And then, in the summer of 1919, a letter arrived. An ordinary piece of mail, and inside it was the idea that would make him a legend. Ponzi had set up a little office on School Street, trying to launch a business directory, the kind of thing that goes nowhere. A company in Spain wrote to him asking for a copy of his catalog. Tucked inside that letter, to cover the cost of a reply, was a small slip of paper he had not seen before. It was called an international reply coupon. Now this is the heart of the whole story, so it is worth slowing down to understand exactly what this thing was. Because Ponzi was about to build an empire on it, and the cruel joke is that the empire never actually touched it. The international reply coupon was a real and rather clever invention of the world's postal services. Imagine you are in one country and you want to write to someone in another country and you would like to pay for their reply, so they do not have to spend their own money on a stamp to write you back. You cannot just mail them a stamp from your country, because your stamps are no good in theirs. So the postal unions of the world agreed on a solution. You could buy this coupon in your home country, mail it abroad, and the person who received it could walk into their own post office and exchange it for the stamps they needed to reply. A coupon bought in Rome could be redeemed for stamps in Boston. It was a way of prepaying postage across borders. Useful, ordinary, dull. But Ponzi looked at that little coupon and saw something glittering. The First World War had just ended, and it had wrecked the currencies of Europe. The Italian lira, the German mark, the Spanish peseta, all of them had collapsed in value against the strong American dollar. And here was the opening. The price of a reply coupon was fixed years before, in each country's own currency. So you could buy one of these coupons in Italy, paying in cheap, devalued lira for what amounted to roughly a penny in American money. Then you could mail it to the United States and exchange it for American stamps worth several times that. On paper, the gap between what you paid in a ruined European economy and what you collected in stable American postage was enormous. Ponzi did the math and claimed the profit could exceed 400%. It sounds like free money. And here is the thing you have to hold on to, because everything turns on it. The gap was real. The arbitrage genuinely existed. A clever person really could buy a coupon cheap in Europe and redeem it for more in America. Ponzi had not invented a fantasy out of nothing. He had found a true crack in the system. The problem, the fatal problem, was not that the trick was fake. The problem was that it could not be scaled, not even close. Think about what it would actually take. Each coupon was worth a few cents. To turn a few cents into millions of dollars, you would need to buy, ship, and redeem coupons by the tens of millions. You would have to physically purchase them at post office windows all over Europe. one at a time, because there was no other way to get them. You would have to ship crates and crates of them across the Atlantic. Then you would have to stand in line at American post offices and exchange them, one at a time, for stamps. And then, and this is the absurd part, you would have to somehow turn millions of postage stamps back into cash, because the post office would give you stamps, not money. There was no machine for any of this. The labor, the shipping, the sheer physical handling of millions of paper slips would have eaten any profit alive. A government investigator would later figure out that just to cover the first handful of investors, Ponzi would have needed something like 53,000 coupons. To cover all the money that eventually came in, you would have needed a fleet of ocean liners hauling nothing but coupons. Ponzi almost certainly understood this. He was not a stupid man, whatever his enemies later said. He may have started out believing he could make the coupon trade work, and there is a real chance he tried it for a while and discovered the truth. But once the money started flowing, the coupons stopped mattering to him entirely. They were never the business. They were the story. They were the beautiful, complicated, technically true explanation he could give to anyone who asked, knowing that almost nobody had the patience or the knowledge to check it. The coupon was the curtain. Behind the curtain was the oldest trick in the world, the very same one he had watched Zarossi run in Montreal a decade before. Pay the old investors with the new investors' money and keep the line moving. In January of 1920, he gave the curtain a respectable name. He called it the Securities Exchange Company, and he opened for business on School Street. The pitch was simple, and it was devastating. "Give me your money," he said, "and in 45 days, I will give it back to you with 50% on top. Or leave it 90 days, and I will double it. 50% in a month and a half. 100% in 3 months. At a time when a good bank paid you 4 or 5% in a whole year." The first month, he took in a grand total of about $1,800 from 18 people. And then those 18 people got paid, on time, in full, with the promised return. That was the spark. Because the surest advertisement in the world is a neighbor who put in $10 and walked out with 15. The word spread through the Italian neighborhoods first, then out across the whole city. By May, Ponzi had taken in over $400,000. By June, the figure passed $2.5 million. By July, money was pouring into that little office at a rate approaching $1 million a week. People were not investing their spare change anymore. They were mortgaging their homes. They were emptying their savings, withdrawing their children's college money, pressing cash into the hands of clerks who could barely write the receipts fast enough. You have to picture the scene to believe it. The line outside the Securities Exchange Company ran down the stairs and out onto the street and around the block. Inmates of the working class stood next to men in fine suits. Wastebaskets and desk drawers overflowed with cash because there was no time to count it, let alone bank it. Ponzi himself, the man who had slept on restaurant floors, now rode through Boston in a custom locomobile, the finest car money could buy. He bought a mansion in the suburb of Lexington with air conditioning and a heated swimming pool, luxuries most people had never heard of. He wore diamond stick pins. He smoked imported cigars in a holder. He gave interviews. The newspapers called him a wizard of finance. Italian immigrants treated him like a hero, living proof that one of their own could beat the Yankee bankers at their own game. There was talk that he might run for office. He let people believe he was about to give $100,000 to charity in his mother's name. And all of it, every dollar of that empire, was being paid out of the pockets of the people still standing in line. There was no profit. There were no coupons of any consequence. When investigators finally went looking, they found that the entire physical stock of international reply coupons in the company's possession was worth about $61. $61 against millions taken in. The machine ran on one thing only: the faith of the next person in line, and the willingness of most people to let their money ride, to roll it over and over again, chasing the next 50%, rather than ever actually taking it home. But a scheme like this has a built-in disease, and the disease is arithmetic. To pay everyone double, you need twice as much money coming in as going out, forever, growing every single month. There is no top to the curve where it levels off and becomes a real business. It must accelerate or it must die. And as the summer of 1920 wore on, the questions began. The first crack came from an unlikely direction. A furniture dealer in Boston who claimed Ponzi owed him money from the old, broke days sued him, and the lawsuit landed Ponzi's name in the papers in a way he could not control. A man advertising 50% returns suddenly tangled in a fight over an unpaid debt. People started to wonder out loud, how exactly was this fellow doing it? And one newspaper decided to find out. The Boston Post was the biggest paper in New England, and its acting publisher, a sharp young man named Richard Grozier, smelled something wrong. Grozier had a delicate problem. His own paper, like everyone else, had run glowing articles about the financial wizard of School Street. To turn on Ponzi now was to risk looking foolish, or worse, malicious, attacking a beloved local figure who had made a lot of his readers rich. But Grozier trusted his instincts, and he put his reporters on it. They started digging into Ponzi's past, and they reached out to the one kind of man who could cut through the romance and look at the numbers cold. They went to a financial expert named Clarence Barron. Clarence Barron was the most respected financial journalist in America. He ran the Dow Jones News Service and the weekly paper that still carries his name today. He was not a man who got swept up in excitement. When the Post asked him to look at Charles Ponzi, he did something almost nobody in that hysterical summer had bothered to do. He took the explanation seriously, and then he checked whether it could possibly be true. Barron's findings, published in the Post in late July, were quiet and lethal. He pointed out, first, that Charles Ponzi did not appear to be investing his own money in his own miraculous scheme. The man promising everyone 50% was keeping his personal savings in ordinary bank accounts, paying ordinary interest. If the coupon trade were real, why would its inventor not pour every cent he had into it? Then Barron did the arithmetic that destroyed the whole thing. For the amount of money Ponzi had taken in to be backed by actual reply coupons, there would have to be something like 160 million of those coupons in circulation around the entire world. The real number of international reply coupons in existence at that moment was about 27,000. Not 27 million, 27,000. The gap between what Ponzi claimed and what physically existed was so vast it was almost funny. The coupons to back his empire did not exist, had never existed, and could not exist. Barron's verdict was plain. Whatever Ponzi was doing, he was not trading coupons. He was, in Barron's words, paying out the money of one line of investors with the deposits of the line coming behind them. When that hit the front page, the spell should have broken at once. It did not immediately. And the reason why is one of the most revealing things in the whole story. A lot of people did not want it to be true. They had money in. Their friends had money in. To believe Barron was to believe they had been fools. And people will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid feeling like fools. Ponzi understood this perfectly. He came out fighting. He gave defiant interviews. He sued the Post for libel, demanding a fortune in damages, daring them to prove him wrong. He projected total calm, and here is the audacious move that nearly saved him. When a wave of frightened investors rushed to School Street demanding their money back, Ponzi paid them. Every one of them. He directed his clerks to refund anybody who showed up with a note, and over a few days he handed out around $2 million, and he did it with a showman's flourish, sending out for coffee and sandwiches for the crowd, walking the line, shaking hands, the picture of a wronged man with nothing to hide. And it worked, for a moment. Some people who came to withdraw their money were so reassured by how easily he paid that they turned around and reinvested it on the spot. But Ponzi was running out of room, and he made one mistake that doomed him. He had not just been a swindler with an office. He had reached for real power. Earlier that year, with the cash flooding in, he had quietly bought his way into a Boston bank called the Hanover Trust Company, the very same bank that had once turned him down for a small loan back when he was nobody. He deposited some $3 million and gained a controlling interest, and for a while he treated it as his own private vault. That move put him squarely in the sights of the people who could actually stop him, the state banking authorities. Because the question now was not just whether one con man was lying to his customers. It was whether a real bank holding the savings of ordinary depositors was being drained to prop up a fraud. The state appointed an auditor, a man named Edwin Pride, to go through Ponzi's books and find out, simply, whether he had the money to cover what he owed. It was a hard job because Ponzi's records were chaos, cash stuffed everywhere, and almost no real bookkeeping, which was itself a kind of answer. While Pride counted, the walls kept closing in. Ponzi had hired a publicity man named William McMasters to help manage his image and feed friendly stories to the press. It was a fatal hire. McMasters was a sharp, experienced newspaperman, and as he sat in Ponzi's office and looked at the operation up close, he stopped believing. He started going through documents, and what he found horrified him. The numbers did not add up. There were no assets behind the promises. McMasters quietly concluded that the man he had been hired to promote was, in plain fact, ruined and operating a fraud. So McMasters did something remarkable. He turned around and took the truth to the Boston Post, the very paper Ponzi was suing. On the 2nd of August, the Post ran McMasters' own account under his own name, and it was brutal precisely because it came from inside Ponzi's own camp. Ponzi, McMasters wrote, was hopelessly insolvent. He owed millions more than he could ever pay. McMasters described his former employer as a financial imbecile who could barely add, a man who sat with his feet on the desk, smoking expensive cigars and talking nonsense about postage coupons, while the whole structure rotted beneath him. Coming from the publicist Ponzi himself had paid, it landed like a hammer. Now the run came in earnest, and there was no charm left that could stop it. The crowds on School Street were no longer hopeful. They were frightened, then angry. The federal authorities moved in. Bank examiners discovered that the account at the heart of his operation was overdrawn by a staggering amount. And then the Post delivered its final blow. The reporters who had been digging into his past found the old Canadian records, and on the 11th of August, the paper ran the story of the forgery and the prison sentence in Montreal, complete with his mugshot. The Wizard of Finance, it turned out, was a convicted forger who had learned the very mechanics of his scheme working in a crooked immigrant bank that collapsed exactly the way his own was now collapsing. The mask was off completely. Charles Ponzi knew it was over. On the 12th of August, 1920, with arrest certain and inevitable, he surrendered to the federal authorities. The Securities Exchange Company was finished. When the auditor finally totaled the wreckage, the picture was grim beyond anything the crowds had feared. Ponzi had taken in something on the order of $15 million over those 8 months, which in the money of that time was an immense fortune, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today. He owed far more than he had. The collapse did not stop with him. It took down the Hanover Trust and several other banks that had been entangled with him, wiping out depositors who had never bought a single one of his notes and had no idea their savings were exposed. In the end, the roughly 40,000 people who had trusted Charles Ponzi got back less than 30 cents on every dollar they had handed him. Many got nothing at all. Families lost homes. Old people lost everything they had saved for a lifetime. The school teacher, the widow, the policeman who had mortgaged the house to ride the wave, they were the ones left holding those pretty printed slips of paper that were now worth exactly nothing. The law took years to finish with him. He pleaded guilty to a federal charge of mail fraud in November of 1920 and was sentenced to 5 years. He served 3.5. The moment he came out, the state of Massachusetts was waiting with its own charges, and the case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which ruled that being prosecuted by the federal government did not shield him from being prosecuted by the state for the same scheme. He acted as his own lawyer, talked his way to an acquittal on one set of charges, deadlocked a jury on another, and was finally convicted and sentenced to a long term in a state prison as, in the words of the court, a common and notorious thief. But the most telling thing about Charles Ponzi is that even after all of that, even after prison and ruin and disgrace, he could not stop. While free on bail during the appeals, he fled to Florida in the middle of the great land boom of the 1920s, and he simply did it again. He set up a company with a name stitched together from his own, the Sharpon Land Syndicate, and he sold tiny parcels of Florida land to eager investors, promising returns of 200% in 60 days. Much of the land he was selling was swamp, underwater, worthless. The pattern was identical. The same impossible promise, the same lovely story, the same gap between what existed and what he claimed. Florida indicted him too. He tried to flee the country disguised as a crewman on a ship bound for Italy, was recognized, and was hauled back to serve more time. When his American prison years were finally done, the country was through with him. In October of 1934, Charles Ponzi was deported to Italy, sent back across the same ocean he had crossed as a hopeful young man 3 decades before, this time with nothing but his notoriety. He bounced from scheme to scheme in Europe, found little success, and eventually landed in Brazil with a job as an agent for an Italian airline. The war ended even that. He grew old, sick, and poor in Rio de Janeiro. He went blind in one eye and was partly paralyzed by a stroke. He died there in January of 1949, in the charity ward of a hospital, leaving behind an estate of about $75, barely enough to bury him. The man whose name became a synonym for ill-gotten millions died with almost exactly what he had arrived in America carrying, $2.50 in spirit, if not in fact, the wheel come all the way around. So what do we actually do with Charles Ponzi now that his name has outlived everything else about him? It would be easy to file him away as a uniquely gifted liar, a one-of-a-kind charmer, the kind of villain who comes along once a century. But that is the comfortable version, and it lets the rest of us off the hook. The honest lesson is harder. Ponzi did not succeed because he was a genius. Clarence Barron unmasked him in an afternoon with a pencil and a willingness to ask one stubborn question: where is the money actually coming from? Ponzi succeeded because thousands of reasonable, hardworking people very much wanted to believe him, and because the explanation he offered was just complicated enough, just true enough at its edges, that almost nobody felt confident enough to challenge it. The reply coupon was real. The arbitrage was real. He hid an impossible promise behind a believable detail, and he counted on the fact that most of us, faced with something we do not fully understand, would rather trust the confident man than admit our own confusion. That is the part that has never gone away. The names change. The story does not. Every few years, somewhere, a new man with a new costume offers returns that cannot be, wrapped in a system too clever to question, and a fresh line forms outside a fresh door. The biggest financial fraud in American history, decades after Ponzi died, ran on the exact same engine, paying old investors with new money, and it fooled banks and charities and sophisticated people who should have known better. For years, the trick did not get smarter. We just keep forgetting that the trick exists. The next time someone offers you a return that seems too good to be true, in a venture you do not quite understand, remember the little man on School Street handing out coffee to the crowd, calm and smiling, with $61 of real coupons in his office and 40,000 people's savings in his drawers. The surest sign of a Ponzi scheme is not greed, And it is not stupidity. It is a story you cannot follow, told by a man who very much hopes you will not try. If you found this story worth your time, and you want more forgotten history like it, take a moment to subscribe.